The blood trickled down Grace Vaughn's face as she stumbled backward, her hand pressed against her throbbing cheek, tears blurring her vision as the hulking figure of Victor Blackstone advanced on her again, his shadow stretching across the dusty street of Coloma, California, like a demon's silhouette in the fading light of 1873. "I told you what would happen if you refused me again," Victor snarled, reaching for her arm with fingers that had already left bruises on her pale skin. "No woman in this town says no to me." Grace had never imagined her life would come to this when she'd arrived in the gold-rush town 3 years earlier. Hopeful and determined after her parents' death left her with nothing but a sewing kit and dreams of a millinery shop of her own. Now 23, those dreams seemed to be dissolving with each blow from a man who believed ownership came through force. "Please," she begged, tasting copper on her split lip. "Just leave me be." She tried to back away, but her heel caught on a loose board in the walkway, sending her tumbling backward into the dirt. The townsfolk who passed by averted their eyes. Victor's father owned the largest mine in the county, and nobody crossed the Blackstones, not even for a seamstress who kept to herself. "You'll learn respect," Victor sneered, raising his hand again as Grace covered her face, bracing for another blow that never came. Instead, a voice cut through the evening air, steady and cool as mountain water. "That's enough." Grace peered through her fingers to see a tall figure standing between her and Victor, his broad shoulders blocking the setting sun. She couldn't make out his face, only the silhouette of a Stetson and the distinctive shape of a gun belt riding low on lean hips. "This ain't your business, stranger," Victor spat, his confidence wavering only slightly as he sized up the newcomer. "When a man raises his hand to a lady in the street, he makes it everybody's business," the stranger replied, his voice carrying a slight drawl that marked him as not from California. "Now back away before I forget my manners." Victor's eyes darted around, noting the small crowd that had begun to gather. His face flushed red with humiliation. "You don't know who I am." "Don't much care either," the stranger replied, not moving an inch, "but I know what you are, and that's enough." For a moment, Grace thought Victor would charge like a bull, but something in the stranger's stance, the casual readiness, the hand that hovered near his holster, made Victor reconsider. With a final glare that promised future retribution, he spat in the dirt and stalked away. The stranger turned then, and Grace saw his face clearly for the first time. He wasn't young, perhaps 30, with eyes the color of whiskey and a face weathered by sun and wind. He crouched beside her, removing his hat to reveal dark hair touched with silver at the temples. "Can you stand, miss?" he asked, offering his hand. Grace nodded, though her legs felt like water as she took his calloused palm. His grip was gentle but firm as he helped her to her feet. "Quentin Sullivan," he introduced himself, replacing his hat once she was steady. "Recently of Texas, currently of nowhere in particular." "Grace Vaughn," she replied, attempting to straighten her disheveled appearance, mortified by the scene that had unfolded. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Sullivan, but I fear you've made an enemy today." Quentin's mouth curved into a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Wouldn't be my first." He produced a clean handkerchief and offered it to her. "Your lips bleeding." Grace accepted it, pressing the cloth against her mouth with trembling fingers. "Victor Blackstone doesn't forget slights." "Neither do I," Quentin replied, his gaze drifting to the street where Victor had disappeared. "Is there someone I can escort you to? Family?" Grace shook her head. "I have a small room above my shop. It's just down the street." "Then I'll see you there safely." He offered his arm, and when she hesitated, added, "No strings, Miss Vaughn. Just want to make sure that fella doesn't circle back." Grace hesitantly placed her hand on his arm, acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople who had witnessed her humiliation and this stranger's intervention. As they walked, she could feel the steady strength in his arm, so different from Victor's aggressive grip. "You're new to Coloma," she observed, trying to distract herself from the pain in her face and the lingering fear in her stomach. "Passed through once during the rush of '49, Quentin replied. "Didn't stay, too many men with gold fever and not enough sense. Thought I'd see how things have changed." "Not enough," Grace murmured. They reached her shop, a modest storefront with Vaughn's Millinery and Tailoring painted on a simple sign above the door. She fumbled with the key, her hands still unsteady. "Allow me," Quentin said, taking the key gently and unlocking the door. He handed it back without entering. "Will you be all right now?" Grace looked up at him, this stranger who'd done more for her in 5 minutes than anyone had in years. "Yes, thank you again, Mr. Sullivan." He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Vaughn." He turned to leave but paused. "If that man troubles you again, you let me know. I'll be at the Western Star Hotel for a spell." "Why would you help me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Years of distrust making her suspicious of kindness, Quentin's expression grew serious. "My mother taught me that a man who raises his hand to a woman isn't a man at all." He glanced back toward the street. "And my father taught me that some lessons need to be reinforced from time to time." With that, he tipped his hat once more and walked away, leaving Grace standing in her doorway, clutching his handkerchief and wondering what twist of fate had brought Quentin Sullivan to Coloma on this particular evening. Inside her shop, Grace lit a lamp and moved to the small mirror hanging behind her counter. She winced at her reflection. Her left cheek was swollen, a purple bruise already forming, and her lip was split at the corner. She dabbed at it with Quentin's handkerchief, noticing the fine quality of the linen and the subtle QS embroidered in one corner. Grace climbed the narrow stairs to her small living quarters above the shop. The space was modest but neat, with a bed covered in a quilt she'd pieced herself, a small table with a single chair and a washstand. A trunk containing all her worldly possessions sat at the foot of the bed. She poured water from a pitcher into the basin and carefully washed her face, wincing as the cool water touched her injuries. As she cleaned away the blood and dirt, her mind returned to the stranger Quentin Sullivan. There had been something in his eyes, something more than just the righteous anger of a gentleman witnessing a lady in distress. She had seen recognition there, as though her pain had awakened something familiar in him. Grace changed into her nightdress and sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the embroidered initials on the handkerchief. She would need to return it, she decided. It would be the proper thing to do. And perhaps, in the light of day, she could properly thank the man who had stepped between her and Victor's rage. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams plagued by Victor's angry face and, strangely, by whiskey-colored eyes that seemed to see too much. Morning brought the usual sounds of Coloma stirring to life, wagons rattling down the main street, merchants opening their shops, miners heading to the diggings that still yielded enough gold to keep the town alive, if no longer booming. Grace dressed carefully, choosing a high-necked blouse that would distract from the bruising on her face, though nothing could hide the swollen lip and discolored cheek entirely. She opened her shop at 8 as usual, though few customers came in the morning hours. Her fingers worked steadily at a hat. She was trimming for Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, but her mind wandered repeatedly to the Western Star Hotel and its new guest. Just before noon, the shop bell jingled, and Grace looked up to see Sheriff Thomas Franklin standing in her doorway, his weathered face set in grim lines beneath his silver mustache. "Miss Vaughn," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Heard there was some trouble last night." Grace set down her work. "Yes, Sheriff. Victor Blackstone came by my office this morning," the sheriff continued, turning his hat in his hands. "Says a stranger in town threatened him." Grace felt indignation rise in her chest. That's not how it happened. Victor was. She stopped, suddenly aware of how little power her word carried against a Blackstone in Coloma. The sheriff sighed. "I know what Victor is, Miss Vaughn. Known him since he was in short pants, and he was mean even then." He stepped further into the shop, lowering his voice. "But his father holds notes on half the businesses in town, including mine, if I'm being honest." "So you're here to what? Warn me to keep quiet?" Grace asked, disappointment sharp in her voice. "I'm here to suggest that your new friend might want to keep his head down," Sheriff Franklin replied. "Victor's looking for him, and he's got some of the mine boys with him. They've been drinking since breakfast." Fear clutched at Grace's heart. "Mr. Sullivan was only helping me." "I figured as much." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Victor says differently, of course, says the man drew on him." "That's a lie," Grace protested. "Mr. Sullivan never even touched his gun." Then you'd best tell him to leave town, Miss Vaughn, the sheriff advised, moving toward the door. Because Victor's not one to let things lie, and I can't protect a stranger against the Blackstones, not in this town. After the sheriff left, Grace stood frozen behind her counter, the half-finished hat forgotten. Quentin Sullivan had placed himself in danger for her sake, and now he might pay the price for his decency. She couldn't let that happen. Hastily locking the shop, Grace hurried down the street toward the Western Star Hotel. The two-story structure was the finest in Coloma, though that wasn't saying much. She entered the small lobby, relieved to find it empty except for the desk clerk, a young man named Eddie who had purchased a tie from her shop the previous month. "Eddie," she called, approaching the desk. "I need to speak with one of your guests, Mr. Sullivan." Eddie's eyes widened at the sight of her face. "Gosh, Miss Vaughn, what happened to you? Please, Eddie, is Mr. Sullivan in?" The young man shook his head. "He went out early, mentioned something about looking at a horse at Peterson's livery." His expression grew troubled. "But Miss Vaughn, there were some fellows asking after him not 20 minutes ago. Rough types from the mine. They didn't seem friendly." Grace's stomach dropped. "Thank you, Eddie." She turned and hurried out, her heart pounding as she made her way toward Peterson's livery at the edge of town. She was halfway there when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the saloon. Slowing her steps, she peered around the corner and felt her blood freeze. Victor stood with 3 burly miners, surrounding Quentin Sullivan. Victor's face was flushed with drink and anger, while Quentin stood calmly, his back to the wall, hands slightly raised but not in surrender, more like a man trying to reason with a dangerous animal. "You made me look like a fool," Victor was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Nobody does that to a Blackstone. You managed that all on your own," Quentin replied evenly. "Beating on a woman in public view doesn't exactly speak to good character." Victor's face darkened. "That whore is my business, not yours." Grace saw something dangerous flash in Quentin's eyes at the slur, but his voice remained steady. "I don't want trouble with you or your friends, Blackstone, but I won't apologize for stopping a man from hitting a lady." "She ain't no lady," one of the miners sneered. "Just a uppity seamstress who thinks she's too good for Coloma men." Victor stepped closer to Quentin. "I'm going to teach you what happens to men who stick their noses in Blackstone business." Before Grace could call out a warning, Victor threw a punch at Quentin's face. What happened next occurred so quickly she almost couldn't follow it. Quentin sidestepped with surprising speed, caught Victor's extended arm, and used the man's momentum to slam him face first into the wall. As Victor crumpled, stunned, the 3 miners rushed forward. Quentin moved with the practiced efficiency of a man well-versed in violence. He ducked under the first miner's wild swing, delivered 2 sharp jabs to the man's ribs, then spun to catch the second attacker with an elbow to the jaw. The third man managed to land a glancing blow to Quentin's shoulder before receiving a devastating uppercut that lifted him off his feet. In less than 30 seconds, all 4 men were on the ground, groaning or unconscious. Quentin stood over them, breathing hard but otherwise appearing unruffled. He straightened his vest, then looked up and saw Grace watching from the alley entrance. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of the violence that had touched both their lives, albeit in different ways. "Are you hurt?" Grace asked, stepping forward. Quentin shook his head. "Nothing serious." He glanced down at the men. "But we should go before they get their wits back." "I came to warn you," Grace said as they walked quickly away from the alley. "Victor was looking for you, found me," Quentin replied dryly, though not to his advantage. They reached the main street, and Quentin guided her toward the hotel with a light touch on her elbow. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe for you to be associated with me right now." "You put yourself in danger for me," Grace countered. "I couldn't let you face it unaware." They entered the hotel, ignoring Eddie's curious stare as they climbed the stairs to the second floor. Quentin unlocked a door and ushered Grace inside, closing it behind them. The room was simple but clean, with a bed, washstand, and single chair. His saddlebags lay neatly on the floor, and a rifle stood propped in the corner. "You've had some practice at fighting," Grace observed, watching as Quentin poured water into the basin and washed a small cut on his knuckle. "Some," he acknowledged. Spent time as a lawman in Texas after the war. Before that, rode with the Rangers for a spell. He dried his hands and turned to face her. But that's not important now. What matters is that Victor Blackstone isn't going to forget this, and next time he won't come at me with just his fists. Grace sank into the chair, the reality of the situation weighing on her. This is my fault. If you had just what? Quentin interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. Let him hit you. Agreed to whatever he wanted from you. None of this is your fault, Miss Vaughn. Grace, she said quietly. Please call me Grace. His expression softened. Grace, then. He sat on the edge of the bed, facing her. Why does Blackstone think he has a claim on you? Grace looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. His father owns the building where my shop is. Victor got it into his head 6 months ago that I should be grateful for the reasonable rent. When I refused his advances, he began to harass me. Yesterday wasn't the first time he's raised his hand to me, but it was the first time in public. Anger flashed across Quentin's face, quickly controlled. Has anyone in town tried to stop him? Grace gave a bitter laugh. The Blackstones own Coloma, Mr. Sullivan. The mine, the bank, half the buildings. Even the sheriff won't cross them. Quentin, he said, mirroring her earlier request. And I've never much cared for bullies, no matter how rich their fathers might be. Grace studied him, this man who had stepped into her life like a character from one of the dime novels she occasionally indulged in reading. You should leave town, she said reluctantly. Victor won't stop, and I don't want your blood on my conscience. Interesting, Quentin said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I was about to suggest you might want to consider the same. Grace blinked in surprise. Leave Coloma, I can't. My shop, my livelihood. Will it be worth much if Victor Blackstone decides to escalate? Quentin asked gently. You said yourself the town won't stand against him. The thought of abandoning everything she'd built over the past 3 years made Grace's chest tighten. Where would I go? Anywhere, Sacramento, San Francisco, Quentin shrugged. I'm heading north myself once my business here is concluded. What business brought you to Coloma? Grace asked, suddenly curious about this man who fought with such controlled precision. A shadow crossed Quentin's face. Looking for someone, an old acquaintance who did some harm to people I cared about. Before Grace could inquire further, a commotion erupted from the street below. They moved to the window together, peering down to see Victor Blackstone, his face bloodied but his stance aggressive, shouting up at the hotel. Sullivan, he bellowed, swaying slightly. Come down and face me like a man. Beside him stood a taller, older man with the same heavy brow but colder eyes, Jonathan Blackstone, Victor's father and the de facto ruler of Coloma. Several armed men flanked them, and a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered at a safe distance. I had a feeling it would come to this, Quentin said quietly. He moved away from the window and retrieved his gun belt from where it hung on the bedpost. You can't go down there, Grace protested, grabbing his arm. They'll kill you. If I don't, they'll come up here, Quentin replied, buckling the belt with practiced ease. And you'd be caught in the middle. Grace felt desperation rising within her. Then I'll go. I'll tell them I lied, that you had nothing to do with no. The word was soft but carried such authority that Grace fell silent. Quentin took her hands in his. Listen to me. Go down the back stairs and through the kitchen. Head for the livery and find a man named Morgan. Tell him Quentin Sullivan says it's time to cash in that favor from Lerdo. I don't understand, Grace said, her voice trembling. Morgan will, Quentin assured her. Now go quickly. What about you? Quentin's smile was grim. I'll be along. Those men down there are drunk and angry, which makes them dangerous but not particularly effective. Grace wanted to argue, to plead with him not to risk his life for her, but something in his eyes told her it would be useless. Instead, she squeezed his hands once, then slipped out the door and down the back stairs as instructed. She made her way to Peterson's livery without incident, the townspeople too focused on the brewing confrontation at the hotel to notice her. Inside the shadowy barn, she found an older man with an iron-gray beard mucking out a stall. Are you Morgan? She asked breathlessly. The man straightened, eyeing her suspiciously. Who's asking? Quentin Sullivan sent me. He said to tell you it's time to cash in that favor from Lerdo. Morgan's weathered face broke into a crooked grin. Well, I'll be damned. That boy always did know how to make an entrance. He set down his pitchfork and wiped his hands on his trousers. Where is he? At the Western Star, the Blackstones have gathered outside demanding he come out. Morgan cursed colorfully. Them Blackstones have been asking for a reckoning for years. He moved to the back of the barn and pulled aside a tarp, revealing a wagon loaded with crates and covered with canvas. Get in and stay down. But Quentin, trust me, miss. If anyone can handle those peacocks, it's Quentin Sullivan. Morgan helped her climb into the wagon, then covered her with the canvas. Stay quiet now. Grace huddled in the darkness, her heart pounding as she heard Morgan moving around the barn, preparing horses. She thought of Quentin facing the Blackstones and their men alone, all because he had defended her. The guilt was almost overwhelming. After what seemed like an eternity, she heard voices approaching the barn, one of them Quentin's, speaking calmly as though he hadn't just walked into a potential ambush. All squared away at the hotel? Morgan asked. For now, Quentin replied. Blackstone Sr. decided a public shootout might be bad for business. We've reached an understanding. Meaning what exactly? Meaning I convinced him that his son assaulting a respectable businesswoman in broad daylight could attract unwanted attention from the territorial authorities, especially given some of the questionable practices at his mine. Morgan chuckled. Always did have a silver tongue when you needed it. Sometimes it's more effective than a gun, Quentin agreed. But we should move quickly. Understandings with men like Blackstone tend to be temporary. Grace felt the canvas being lifted, and she blinked in the sudden light. Quentin stood beside the wagon, looking remarkably unruffled for a man who had just faced down a mob. His eyes softened when they met hers. Are you all right? He asked. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Good, we need to leave town. Morgan's agreed to take us as far as Auburn. Quentin extended his hand to help her from the wagon. From there, we can decide our next move. Grace found her voice. Mr. Sullivan, Quentin, you've already done more than enough. I can't ask you to, you're not asking, he interrupted gently. I'm offering. The Blackstones won't forgive either of us, and it's safer if we travel together, at least for now. His hand remained extended, steady and sure. Will you come? Grace looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his face. In his eyes, she saw not pity or obligation, but something deeper, a genuine concern that stirred something within her she had thought long dormant. Yes, she said, placing her hand in his. I will. Morgan cleared his throat. Touching as this is, we'd best get moving before those Blackstone boys change their minds. They worked quickly, transferring Quentin's few possessions from the hotel to the wagon. Grace had nothing but the clothes she wore. Everything she owned was in her shop, but there was no time to retrieve anything without risking discovery. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Franklin appeared at the barn door, his expression troubled. Thought I'd find you here, he said to Quentin. Blackstone's calmed down for now, but he's already sent for some hard cases from Sacramento. They'll be here by tomorrow. We'll be gone by then, Quentin replied, continuing to secure a tarp over the wagon's contents. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Listen, Sullivan. I'm not proud of how things are in this town. If I could change it, but you can't, Quentin finished for him. I understand how it works, Sheriff. No need to explain. Franklin turned to Grace. Miss Vaughn, I'm sorry it's come to this. You were a credit to Coloma. Grace appreciated the sentiment, even if it came too late. Thank you, Sheriff. As Franklin left, Morgan climbed onto the wagon's seat. Time to go. Quentin helped Grace up beside Morgan, then mounted a lean chestnut gelding that had been saddled and waiting. I'll ride ahead, make sure the road's clear, he told Morgan. As they pulled away from Coloma, Grace looked back at the town that had been her home for 3 years. Her shop, her few possessions, the modest life she had built, all left behind because one man couldn't accept rejection. Don't you worry about your things, Morgan said, as if reading her thoughts. Quentin's arranged for someone to pack up your shop and send your possessions on to Sacramento when things cool down. He thought of that. Grace asked, surprised. Morgan chuckled. That boy thinks of everything. Always has, even when he was green as spring grass riding with the Rangers. How do you know him? Served with his father during the Mexican War, then later crossed paths with Quentin during his Ranger days. Morgan flicked the reins, urging the horses to a steady pace. He saved my hide in Lerdo. Some bandits had me cornered and that boy rode in like the wrath of God himself. Grace glanced ahead to where Quentin rode, straight-backed and alert. He's handy in a fight. Best I've ever seen, Morgan agreed, but he's got a good head on his shoulders too. Knows when to fight and when to talk. That's rare in these parts. They traveled through the afternoon, following the road that wound through the foothills. Quentin rode ahead, occasionally disappearing from view only to reappear at a bend in the road, waiting to ensure they were still coming along safely. By evening, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Coloma. They made camp in a small clearing beside a creek. Morgan unhitched the horses while Quentin built a fire and prepared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and coffee. Grace felt helpless, having nothing to contribute. "I wish I had something to offer," she said as Quentin handed her a tin plate. "You're here," he replied simply. "That's contribution enough for now." After they ate, Morgan excused himself to check on the horses, leaving Grace and Quentin alone by the fire. In the flickering light, his features seemed both harder and gentler, somehow the angles of his face more pronounced, but his eyes warmer. "Will you tell me why you're really in California?" Grace asked. "You mentioned looking for someone." Quentin was silent for a moment, stirring the fire with a stick. "My younger sister, Emily," he finally said. "She married a man named Howard Blackstone 6 years ago in Texas." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Blackstone. Is he Jonathan Blackstone's brother?" Quentin confirmed. "Came to Texas after the war, set himself up as a businessman in Austin, charmed my sister completely." His voice hardened. 2 years into their marriage, she wrote to me about his temper, about the beatings. I was in Arizona by then, tracking a gang of cattle rustlers. By the time I got her letter and made it back to Austin, she was dead. Grace's hand went to her mouth. "Oh, Quentin, I'm so sorry." "They said she fell down the stairs," he continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "But I knew, the doctor knew too, but Howard had half the town in his pocket by then." He looked up at Grace, and the pain in his eyes made her heart ache. "Howard disappeared before I could find him. Took me nearly 4 years to track him to California. Found out he'd gone back to his real name, Victor." "Victor," Grace's mind spun with the revelation. "You mean Victor Blackstone is Howard Blackstone, my sister's husband, my sister's murderer?" Quentin's voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. "I came to Coloma to find him, to make him answer for what he did. And then you saw him attacking me," Grace said softly, understanding dawning. Quentin nodded. "History repeating itself. I couldn't stand by, not again." He set down the stick and rubbed his hands over his face. "I'm sorry for bringing you into this, Grace. I never intended to involve anyone else." "Don't apologize," Grace said firmly. "If anyone should be sorry, it's me. You came seeking justice for your sister and ended up having to rescue a stranger." "Maybe it wasn't chance," Quentin said, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Maybe I was meant to be there." The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Grace felt a connection to this man that defied the short time they had known each other, a recognition of shared pain, shared strength. Morgan returned then, breaking the spell. "We should get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow." They set up a simple camp, Grace taking Morgan's bedroll while the men kept watch in shifts. Despite her exhaustion, Grace lay awake for a long time, thinking of Quentin's story and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. She woke at dawn to find Quentin already up, tending the fire and brewing coffee. His face looked drawn, as though he hadn't slept much. "Morning," he greeted her, offering a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Thank you." She accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some," he replied, though his eyes told a different story. "We should reach Auburn by midday. Morgan knows people there who can help us." "And then?" Grace asked. Quentin hesitated. "That depends on you. I still have business with Victor Blackstone, but you're free to go wherever you wish. Sacramento, San Francisco, you could start over." The thought of parting ways with Quentin so soon left an unexpected hollow feeling in Grace's chest. "And if I wanted to stay with you?" Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something warmer. "It would be dangerous," he warned. The Blackstones won't give up easily. Neither will I, Grace replied with a firmness that surprised even her. I've been running from Victor's attention for months. I'm tired of being afraid. Before Quentin could respond, Morgan emerged from the trees, his expression grim. Riders coming, 6, maybe 7, moving fast. Quentin was on his feet instantly. How far? Half-mile, maybe less, coming from Coloma direction. Blackstone's men, Quentin said, his hand moving to his gun. Pack up quickly, we need to move. They broke camp in minutes, leaving no trace. Morgan drove the wagon deeper into the woods off the main trail, while Quentin helped Grace mount his horse. Stay with Morgan, he instructed, handing her the reins. The wagon will be slower, but they'll be looking for riders on the main road. What about you? Grace asked, alarmed. I'll lead them away, then circle back. No, Grace protested. It's too dangerous. Quentin's hand covered hers briefly. I've been in worse spots, trust me. Before she could argue further, he slapped the horse's rump, sending it trotting after the wagon. Grace looked back to see him disappear into the underbrush, moving with the silent efficiency of a man accustomed to living by his wits. The wagon creaked slowly through the woods, Morgan guiding the team with expert hands. Don't fret, he told Grace, noting her worried expression. Quentin knows what he's doing. Those men will kill him if they catch him, she said, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Morgan's weathered face creased in a smile. Then it's a good thing they won't catch him. They traveled for nearly an hour through increasingly rough terrain, the wagon jolting over roots and rocks. Grace's worry for Quentin grew with each passing minute. Finally, Morgan pulled the team to a halt in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine. We'll wait here, he said, jumping down from the seat. He'll find us. Grace dismounted, leading Quentin's horse to water at a small spring. As she waited, she realized how quickly her life had changed. 2 days ago, she had been a shopkeeper in Coloma, enduring Victor Blackstone's unwanted attentions, but clinging to the life she had built. Now she was a fugitive, fleeing with a former Texas Ranger on a mission of vengeance. Strangely, despite the danger and uncertainty, Grace felt more alive than she had in years. The constant fear that had been her companion in Coloma had been replaced by a different kind of tension, one mixed with hope and possibility. A twig snapped, and Grace spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Quentin emerged from the trees, dusty but unharmed, and relief washed over her so strongly that she moved without thinking, crossing the clearing in quick steps to throw her arms around him. He stiffened momentarily in surprise, then his arms came around her, solid and reassuring. I'm all right, he murmured against her hair. Grace stepped back, suddenly embarrassed by her impulsive action. I was worried. Quentin's eyes softened. No need. I led them on a wild chase toward the river. They'll be hours figuring out they've been duped. He looked over at Morgan. We should move out, take the North Trail to Auburn. They'll expect us to head east. They continued their journey, more cautious now, taking less traveled paths through the foothills. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Auburn, a town larger and more established than Coloma. Morgan directed them to a modest house on the edge of town. My sister's place, he explained. She's a widow, lives alone. We'll be safe here for the night. Leaner Morgan proved to be as taciturn as her brother, but hospitable in her own gruff way. She provided a hot meal, clean clothes for Grace, and no questions about why they had arrived unexpectedly with a young woman in tow. After dinner, Morgan and his sister retired to the kitchen, leaving Grace and Quentin alone in the small sitting room. What happens now? Grace asked, smoothing the borrowed dress over her knees. Quentin leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I need to finish what I started, he said quietly. Victor Blackstone, Howard needs to answer for what he did to Emily. You mean to kill him? Grace stated, not a question. Quentin looked up, his eyes troubled. I've thought of nothing else for 4 years, tracked him across 3 states. He ran a hand through his hair. But now I'm not sure that's the answer. What changed? Grace asked, though she thought she knew. You, he said simply. Seeing you stand up to him, refused to be broken. It reminded me that Emily wouldn't want me to become a killer in her name. He shook his head. But I can't just walk away. He'll hurt someone else he already tried with you. There are other kinds of justice, Grace suggested. You said Victor Howard is wanted in Texas. For questioning in Emily's death, yes, but proving murder after all this time. He trailed off, the obstacles clear. What if there were other charges? Grace leaned forward. The mine. Morgan mentioned questionable practices. What if there was evidence of that? Quentin's expression sharpened with interest. Go on. In town, people whispered about conditions at the mine. Men dying in accidents that weren't accidents. Chinese laborers disappearing. Grace's mind raced with possibilities. If someone could gather evidence, bring it to the territorial authorities. It could work, Quentin said slowly. Jonathan Blackstone might be powerful in Coloma, but the governor in Sacramento wouldn't look kindly on labor abuses, especially with the anti-Chinese sentiment already causing problems. We would need proof, Grace pointed out. Documents, witnesses. Morgan might know where to start. He's been in these parts for years. Quentin reached out, taking her hand. But Grace, this would be dangerous, more dangerous than running away. Grace looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused, her smaller but equally marked by years of work. I'm tired of running, she said softly. Aren't you? His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending warmth up her arm. Yes, he admitted. I am. They spent the next week in Auburn, planning carefully. Morgan, it turned out, had connections throughout the mining communities of the Sierra foothills, former prospectors, merchants, even a lawyer in Sacramento who specialized in labor disputes. Slowly, a picture emerged of the Blackstone operation. Dangerous conditions, bribery of officials, even suspected murder to silence complaints. Grace used her skills as a seamstress to alter her appearance, creating a plain, severe dress and bonnet that transformed her into a respectable widow. With her face healed and her hair styled differently, she doubted even Victor would recognize her immediately. Quentin was more difficult to disguise, his height and bearing too distinctive. In the end, they decided he would remain out of sight while Grace and Morgan gathered information. I don't like sending you into danger, Quentin told her the night before they were to return to Coloma. They stood in Aliner's garden, the evening air fragrant with late summer blooms. Grace had come to treasure these quiet moments with Quentin, moments when the lines of worry eased from his face and he seemed to find some measure of peace. I'll be with Morgan, she reassured him. And Victor thinks I've fled. He won't be looking for a widowed seamstress seeking work. Quentin reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. When did you become so brave? I've always been brave, Grace replied with a small smile. I just needed reminding. His eyes darkened, and for a moment Grace thought he might kiss her. Her heart quickened at the possibility, but Quentin stepped back, his hand falling to his side. We should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow will be a long day. Grace nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. As she turned to go inside, Quentin caught her hand. Grace, he said, his voice low. When this is over, I'd like to talk about what comes after. After, she repeated, hope rising in her chest. For us, he clarified, the words clearly difficult for him. If you'd be amenable, Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. I would be very amenable, Quentin Sullivan. The plan was simple, but risky. Grace would pose as a widow seeking to sell sewing services to the mine workers' families, allowing her access to the mining camp. Morgan would use his old prospector contacts to gather information about safety violations. Meanwhile, Quentin would remain in hiding, coordinating their efforts and preparing to present their evidence to the territorial prosecutor in Sacramento. Grace and Morgan returned to Coloma 3 days later, arriving separately to avoid suspicion. Grace took a room at a small boarding house on the opposite side of town from her former shop, introducing herself as Mrs. Gray, recently widowed and seeking work. The mining camp was a collection of rough cabins and tents on the hillside above town. Grace made her way there with a basket of sewing samples, her heart pounding but her expression composed. She spent the day moving from cabin to cabin, offering her services to the miners' wives and quietly gathering information. By evening, she had confirmed rumors of several deaths attributed to accidents that the miners' families insisted were due to neglected safety measures. More disturbingly, she heard whispered accounts of men who had spoken out against conditions at the mine subsequently disappearing or being found dead. As she made her way back to town, Grace was so preoccupied with what she had learned that she didn't notice the figure following her, until a hand clamped over her mouth, dragging her into the shadow of a building. "Well, well," Victor Blackstone's voice hissed in her ear, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey. "Look who's come back to Coloma." Grace struggled against his grip, but he was too strong, his fingers digging painfully into her arms as he spun her to face him. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize you?" he sneered. A different dress and hairstyle don't change those pretty eyes. Fear threatened to paralyze her, but Grace forced herself to remain calm. "Let me go, Victor. People will be looking for me." He laughed, the sound ugly in the gathering darkness. "Your gunslinger friend, we found him 2 days ago trying to sneak back into town. He won't be coming to save you this time." Grace's blood ran cold. "You're lying." "Am I?" Victor's grip tightened. "Why don't we go somewhere private to discuss it? My father's house is empty tonight." Grace knew if she went with him, she likely wouldn't survive the night. Gathering her courage, she brought her knee up sharply between his legs. Victor doubled over with a howl of pain, his grip loosening enough for Grace to break free. She ran, not toward the boarding house but toward the sheriff's office. If Quentin had been captured, or she couldn't bring herself to complete the thought the sheriff might know. She burst through the door to find the office empty except for a young deputy dozing at the desk. He jolted awake at her entrance. "Mrs. Gray," he exclaimed, recognizing her from her introduction upon arriving in town. "What's happened? Where is Sheriff Franklin?" Grace demanded, glancing behind her to ensure Victor wasn't following. "Out at the Blackstone estate," the deputy replied, concerned by her obvious distress. "There was some trouble with one of the miners." He asked Mr. Blackstone some inappropriate questions about working conditions, got himself arrested. Relief washed over Grace if the sheriff was dealing with a miner's complaint. It was unlikely Quentin had been captured. Victor had been lying. "Mrs. Gray, are you all right?" The deputy asked, standing now. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Grace assured him, composing herself. "Just thought I saw someone following me in the dark. Probably nothing." The deputy reached for his hat. "I'll walk you back to your boarding house, madam." "These streets aren't safe for a lady after dark." Grace accepted his escort gratefully, using the opportunity to subtly question him about recent events in town. The deputy, eager to impress the pretty widow, shared that tensions at the mine had been increasing, with rumors of a possible strike. Jonathan Blackstone had responded by bringing in more armed guards and threatening to close the mine entirely if the workers didn't settle down. At the boarding house, Grace thanked the deputy and hurried to her room, locking the door securely behind her. She moved to the window, opening it to the agreed-upon signal, a candle placed so that its light would be visible from the street at exactly 9 o'clock. At 9:30, a soft tap came at her door. Grace approached cautiously. "Who is it?" "A friend from Auburn," came the quiet reply, the password she and Quentin had arranged. Grace unlocked the door, relief flooding through her as Quentin slipped inside. Without thinking, she threw herself into his arms. "Victor said they'd found you," she murmured against his chest. "I was so afraid." Quentin held her tightly, his cheek resting against her hair. "I'm fine, but we have a problem. Morgan's been arrested." Grace pulled back to look at his face. "What? How?" He was meeting with some of the miners, gathering statements about safety violations. Quentin guided her to sit on the edge of the bed, taking the chair opposite. "Someone informed on them. Sheriff Franklin took Morgan and 3 miners to the Blackstone estate for questioning." "The deputy mentioned trouble with a miner," Grace said, "but he didn't say anything about Morgan." "They probably don't know who he really is," Quentin reasoned. "He was using a false name, but if they search him, they'll find documents that could lead back to us." Grace's mind raced. "What do we do?" "I've sent word to our contact in Sacramento. He'll be here with territorial marshals by tomorrow evening." Quentin ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "But Morgan might not have that long. We need to get him out," Grace said decisively. Quentin looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "It's too dangerous. The Blackstone estate is heavily guarded. But I could get in," Grace pointed out. As Mrs. Gray, the widow seeking sewing work, Mrs. Blackstone was one of the women I spoke with today. She mentioned needing alterations on some dresses. Absolutely not, Quentin said firmly. Victor recognized you once already. It's too risky. We can't leave Morgan there, Grace insisted. You said yourself they might search him, find the documents. Quentin stood, pacing the small room. There must be another way. They argued in hushed voices for nearly an hour, neither willing to yield. Finally, Grace placed her hand on Quentin's arm, stopping his pacing. Listen to me, she said softly. Morgan risked himself to help us. We owe him the same loyalty. She took a deep breath. And I'm not the same woman who cowered from Victor in Coloma. I can do this, Quentin. I need to do this. Quentin looked down at her, his expression torn between pride and fear. If anything happened to you. It won't, she promised. I'll be careful. In the end, they compromised. Grace would visit the Blackstone estate in the morning, ostensibly to discuss sewing work with Mrs. Blackstone. While there, she would try to locate Morgan and, if possible, pass him a small lock pick Quentin provided. Meanwhile, Quentin would position himself near the estate, ready to create a diversion if needed. They spent the night planning, going over every detail until both were satisfied. As dawn approached, Grace realized they had been sitting close together on the bed for hours, their shoulders touching, their voices intimate in the quiet room. Despite the danger ahead, she felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. You should try to sleep, Quentin said, noticing her stifling a yawn. So should you, she countered. He smiled, the expression softening his features in the lamplight. I'll keep watch. Grace knew she should insist he rest, but the thought of sleeping under his protection was too comforting to resist. She lay down on the bed, not bothering to remove her dress. Quentin, she said as he moved to the chair by the window, when this is over, what will you do? He was silent for a long moment, his profile outlined against the pale pre-dawn light. I've been chasing ghosts for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to live any other way. You could learn, Grace suggested, her voice soft with approaching sleep. We both could. The morning brought clear skies and a chill in the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Grace dressed carefully in her widow's attire, adding a few touches to enhance her disguise, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles Morgan had provided, a different way of arranging her hair. Quentin watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. You make a convincing widow, Mrs. Gray. Let's hope Mrs. Blackstone thinks so too, Grace replied, adjusting her bonnet. They left the boarding house separately, Quentin departing first to take up his position near the Blackstone estate. Grace followed an hour later, carrying her sewing basket with samples of work prominently displayed on top and the lock pick concealed in a hidden pocket. The Blackstone estate stood on a hill overlooking Coloma, a sprawling mansion that seemed designed to remind the town of its owner's wealth and power. Grace approached the front gate with her heart pounding, but her expression composed. A guard stopped her, suspicious at first, but the mention of Mrs. Blackstone's request for a seamstress gained her entry. She was escorted to a sitting room where Harriet Blackstone, a pale, nervous woman in her 50s, greeted her with obvious relief. Mrs. Gray, thank you for coming so promptly, she said, dismissing the guard with a wave. I have several dresses requiring attention before the governor's visit next month. Grace set to work examining the garments, using the opportunity to engage Mrs. Blackstone in conversation. The older woman, clearly starved for female company, proved surprisingly talkative. Such excitement last night, Mrs. Blackstone confided as Grace pinned a hem. Sheriff Franklin brought in some troublemakers from the mine. My husband was furious, says they're trying to organize the workers. How dreadful, Grace murmured, her pulse quickening. Where are these men now? In the old storehouse, I believe. Jonathan converted part of it to a holding cell years ago. Mrs. Blackstone lowered her voice. He doesn't trust the town jail, says the sheriff is too soft-hearted. Grace worked steadily, her mind racing as she planned her next move. She needed to find a reason to go near the storehouse, which she had noticed at the edge of the property when arriving. An opportunity presented itself when Mrs. Blackstone mentioned a tea stain on a tablecloth that needed attention. It's in the laundry room near the kitchen, she explained. Would you mind taking a look while you're here? The laundress has tried everything. Of course, Grace agreed, gathering her sewing basket, if you could direct me. Mrs. Blackstone provided directions that would take Grace past the storehouse exactly what she had hoped for. As she made her way across the grounds, Grace moved with purposeful confidence, nodding to the few servants she passed as if she belonged there. The storehouse was a large wooden building, its windows small and set high in the walls. A single guard stood by the door, looking bored and half asleep in the morning sun. Grace approached directly, her expression concerned. "Excuse me," she called. "Mrs. Blackstone sent me to check on the prisoners. She's worried they haven't been fed properly." The guard straightened, suspicious. "Mrs. Blackstone ain't never cared about prisoners before." "The governor is visiting next month," Grace improvised. "She's concerned about appearances." "You know how these society ladies are." She offered a conspiratorial smile that seemed to ease the guard's suspicions. "They got water and bread earlier," he said, relaxing slightly. "Don't need nothing else." "I should still check," Grace insisted. Mrs. Blackstone was quite specific. "I wouldn't want to disappoint her or have her mention my failure to Mr. Blackstone." The implied threat worked. The guard hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine, but be quick about it." He unlocked the door, allowing Grace to enter. The interior was dim after the bright sunshine, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. The storehouse had been divided, with the front portion still used for storage and a makeshift cell constructed at the back little more than a cage with iron bars. Inside sat 4 men, one of whom was Morgan. He showed no sign of recognition when he saw Grace, which she took as a cue to maintain her disguise. "Mrs. Blackstone sent me to check if you need anything," she announced loudly for the guard's benefit. As she spoke, she moved closer to the bars, positioning herself so the guard couldn't see her hands. "Could use some decent food," one of the miners grumbled. "And maybe a lawyer," added another. Grace made a show of examining them for injuries. "You all seem well enough. I'll let Mrs. Blackstone know." As she turned to leave, she pretended to stumble, catching herself on the bars near where Morgan sat. In that brief moment, she pressed the lock pick into his hand, her eyes meeting his in silent communication. Morgan's fingers closed around the small tool, his expression never changing. "Careful there, madam," he said gruffly. "Floor's uneven." "Thank you," Grace replied, straightening. "I'll be sure Mrs. Blackstone sends some proper food." She left the storehouse with her heart pounding but her step measured and calm. The guard locked the door behind her, already losing interest now that his duty was done. Grace continued to the laundry room as planned, spending enough time examining the tablecloth to make her visit seem legitimate before returning to Mrs. Blackstone with suggestions for removing the stain. By noon, she had completed her work at the mansion and was preparing to leave when commotion erupted from the direction of the storehouse. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew everyone's attention. "What on earth?" Mrs. Blackstone exclaimed, moving to the window. Grace joined her, her breath catching at the sight of Morgan and the 3 miners running across the grounds, pursued by guards. In the distance, near the property's edge, she glimpsed a familiar figure on horseback, Quentin, providing covering fire that kept the guards from getting too close to the escaping prisoners. "Oh my," Grace gasped, playing the part of the shocked seamstress. "What's happening?" "The prisoners are escaping," Mrs. Blackstone clutched at her throat. "We should get away from the windows, Mrs. Gray. There might be shooting." Grace allowed herself to be led to an interior room, all the while watching through doorways as the estate erupted into chaos. Jonathan Blackstone appeared, bellowing orders while servants scurried in confusion. In the midst of the disorder, Grace slipped away, making her way to the front gate where no guard remained at his post. She walked quickly down the road, resisting the urge to run, until she reached the agreed-upon meeting place, a stand of trees half a mile from the estate. Quentin was waiting, his expression tight with concern. "Did anyone follow you?" "No," Grace assured him, relief making her light-headed. "Morgan," he and the miners made it to the rendezvous point. "They're with our contact from Sacramento now, giving statements about conditions at the mine." Quentin helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her. "We need to move quickly. Once Blackstone realizes you're gone, he'll put it together." They rode hard for several miles, following a little-used trail through the hills. By late afternoon, they reached a small cabin where Morgan waited with a tall, distinguished man Grace hadn't met before. "Grace, this is Judge Wilson from the Territorial Court," Quentin introduced them. "He's been building a case against the Blackstones for months." Judge Wilson shook her hand, his manner courtly despite the rustic surroundings. "Miss Vaughn, Mr. Sullivan has told me about your bravery. The testimonies you and Mr. Morgan have gathered will be invaluable. Will it be enough?" Grace asked, acutely aware of how powerful the Blackstones were. The judge's expression grew serious. "With what we have now, I can bring charges against Jonathan Blackstone for safety violations, bribery, and obstruction of justice." He glanced at Quentin. "As for the other matter, your sister, that may be more difficult to prove after so much time." Quentin nodded, his disappointment visible only to Grace, who had come to read his expressions so well. "I understand. The important thing is stopping them from hurting anyone else." They spent the evening reviewing the evidence and preparing for what would come next. Judge Wilson would return to Sacramento to secure warrants, then come back with a force of marshals to arrest the Blackstones and seize documents from the mine office. "You should both remain here until it's done," the judge advised as he prepared to leave. "It's safer." After he and Morgan departed, Grace and Quentin were left alone in the small cabin. A single lamp cast warm light across the simple room, with its rough wooden table and 2 chairs, a small cookstove, and a narrow bed in the corner. "You were remarkable today," Quentin said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "I've known seasoned lawmen who wouldn't have handled that situation as well as you did." Grace smiled, warming under his praise. "I was terrified the entire time." "That's what courage is," Quentin replied, "being afraid but doing what needs to be done anyway." He moved to stand by the cabin's single window, looking out at the night. The set of his shoulders told Grace he was troubled. "What is it?" she asked softly, joining him. "Judge Wilson is right about Emily," Quentin said after a moment. "Even if Victor is arrested for the mine violations, I may never be able to prove what he did to her." He turned to face Grace, his eyes haunted. 4 years of searching, and this might be all the justice she gets. Grace reached for his hand, entwining her fingers with his. "She gets you remembering her, honoring her by stopping Victor from hurting anyone else." She hesitated, then added, "and maybe by finding happiness again." Quentin's gaze held hers, something shifting in his expression. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "These past weeks, with everything happening, I haven't had the right to think about happiness." "Everyone has that right," she countered, stepping closer to him. "Even you, even me." His free hand came up to touch her face, fingertips tracing the line of her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "When I saw Victor strike you that first day in Coloma, something broke loose inside me, something I'd kept locked away since Emily died." His thumb brushed the corner of her mouth. "It wasn't just about vengeance anymore, it was about you." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "And now," Quentin said, drawing her closer, "now I'm thinking about what comes next." His arm slid around her waist. "If you'd have me, Grace Vaughn, I'd like to see what that might be together." In answer, Grace rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as years of loneliness and longing gave way to something new and hopeful. Quentin's arms tightened around her, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. When they finally parted, breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that days ago," he murmured. Grace smiled. "We have time to make up for it." They spent the night talking, planning, sharing pieces of themselves that had been too painful or private to reveal before. Grace told him about losing her parents, about coming to California with dreams of independence, only to find herself increasingly trapped by Victor's obsession. Quentin spoke of his years with the Rangers, of the sister he had adored, of the emptiness that had driven him across half the country in search of her killer. As dawn approached, they finally slept, Grace curled against Quentin's chest, his arm protective around her even in slumber. They were awakened mid-morning by the sound of horses approaching. Quentin was instantly alert, gun in hand as he moved to the window. "It's Morgan," he said with relief, holstering his weapon. "And Judge Wilson. They're back sooner than expected." The news they brought was both stunning and disturbing. Jonathan Blackstone was dead apparently by his own hand after learning that warrants had been issued for his arrest. Victor had fled, taking what money he could gather, but had been apprehended trying to board a steamer in Sacramento. He'll stand trial for the mine violations, Judge Wilson informed them, and I've telegraphed the authorities in Texas. They're sending someone to interview him about your sister's death, Sullivan. Will that be enough? Grace asked, seeing the conflict in Quentin's eyes. It will have to be, the judge replied. The law may be imperfect, Miss Vaughn, but it's all we have to separate us from chaos. In the days that followed, Grace and Quentin returned to Coloma to find the town in turmoil. With Jonathan Blackstone dead and Victor in custody, the mine's future was uncertain. Workers feared for their jobs, while others saw opportunity in the vacuum left by the Blackstones' downfall. To Grace's surprise, her shop remained untouched, everything just as she had left it the day she fled with Quentin. She stood in the middle of the familiar space, running her fingers over the spools of thread, the half-finished hat still sitting on her workbench. It feels strange, she told Quentin as he helped her reopen the shutters, letting light into the dusty interior, like returning to a life that belonged to someone else. Does it still feel like home? He asked, watching her closely. Grace considered the question, looking around at the shop she had worked so hard to build. It did once, she said finally, but now, I think home might be somewhere else, with someone else. Quentin crossed the room to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. When I came to Coloma, I was looking for an ending closure for Emily, justice for what was done to her. His thumbs traced circles on her palms. Instead, I found a beginning, with you. What are you saying, Quentin Sullivan? Grace asked, her heart beating faster. He smiled, the expression transforming his face, erasing years of grief and solitary purpose. I'm saying that wherever you go next, I'd like to go with you. As your husband, if you'll have me. Joy bloomed in Grace's chest, so intense it nearly took her breath away. Are you proposing to me in my hat shop, Mr. Sullivan? I am, he confirmed, his eyes warm with love, though I realize it's not the most romantic setting. On the contrary, Grace said, stepping closer until they were mere inches apart. It's perfect. This shop represents everything I built on my own, everything I thought I needed to be happy. She reached up to touch his face. And you represent everything I never knew I was missing. Is that a yes? Quentin asked, his arms encircling her waist. It is, Grace affirmed, rising on her toes to meet his kiss. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony performed by Judge Wilson before he returned to Sacramento. Morgan stood as witness, his gruff exterior softening as he watched Quentin take Grace's hand and call her his forever. News came from Texas that Victor Blackstone had confessed to Emily's murder in exchange for a reduced sentence on the mine violations. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, never again able to harm another woman. Does it feel like justice? Grace asked Quentin as they sat on the porch of the small house they had purchased on the outskirts of Auburn, far enough from Coloma to start fresh, but close enough for Grace to maintain connections with her loyal customers. Not entirely, Quentin admitted, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the sunset paint the Sierra foothills in gold. But Emily can rest now, and so can I. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Thanks to you, to us, Grace corrected, leaning into his embrace. We saved each other, I think. Spring brought new beginnings, a small shop in Auburn, where Grace's skills as a seamstress quickly earned her a reputation among the town's better families, and a position for Quentin as deputy to the county sheriff. Their home, modest but warm, became a place of laughter and love, so different from the lives they had led before finding each other. And when summer came again, Grace shared news that brought tears to Quentin's eyes. They would be welcoming a child in the winter. A daughter, she was certain, though Quentin insisted it would be a son. Either way, he said, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach, this child will know only love, never fear. And stories, Grace added. About a brave aunt named Emily, and how her brother crossed half a country to honor her memory. And about a courageous mother, Quentin continued, who refused to be broken by cruelty, who helped bring justice when it seemed impossible. Their son, Thomas, was born on a clear December morning, with Morgan pacing outside like a nervous grandfather. A daughter, Emily Grace, followed 2 years later, her arrival coinciding with Quentin's appointment as sheriff of Auburn after his predecessor retired. Life was not always easy. The mining country remained a place of boom and bust, of fortunes made and lost, but it was rich with purpose and love. Grace's shop flourished, expanding to include a partner who specialized in fine embroidery. Quentin's reputation for fairness made him respected throughout the county, even by those who occasionally found themselves on the wrong side of his law. On warm evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching their children play in the yard, marveling at how fate had brought them together in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Do you ever miss Texas?" Grace asked one such evening as they celebrated 10 years of marriage. Quentin considered the question, his arm around her shoulders as familiar and comforting as ever. "Sometimes I miss the open country, the big sky." He pressed a kiss to her temple, silver now threading his dark hair as it did hers. "But I found everything that matters here." Grace leaned into his embrace, thinking of the frightened woman she had been, the beating that had nearly broken her spirit, and the man who had stepped between her and danger, offering his hand when she needed it most. "Lucky for me," she murmured, turning her face up to his, "you called me yours forever." "The luckiest day of my life," Quentin agreed, bending to kiss her as their children's laughter rang through the golden California evening, a symphony of the happiness they had built together from the ashes of pain.